Welcome back, guys. Okay, next up, we're going to get started with Microsoft Graph. Now, if you're not familiar with what Graph is, Wikipedia defines it as a developer platform that connects multiple services and devices. Now, that's kind of a generic overview, if you ask me. And to be honest, I'm not going to get into a deep dive explanation as to what exactly Graph is, but essentially, it's an API that exposes various functionality related to Office 365 that you can use to build out or enhance a custom application. So if you want to learn more about Graph, there's a great blog series by Brian Jacket called 30 Days of Microsoft Graph, and it's a great starting point if you really want to kind of dive in. Um, for our use case, we're going to actually leverage some of the concepts covered in that blog series, and we're going to, I wouldn't say expand on it, I would say we're going to sort of branch off in a different direction and build out our functionality related to our custom use case here. So on that note, I'm going to jump back to this little flowchart graph thing that I have from the first video, and we're going to look at what exactly we're going to be doing with Microsoft Graph. So if you remember, we have our exec assistant who's going to enter an event into a SharePoint calendar, and that's going to obviously get saved to SharePoint, and we have to get that same data over to an Outlook calendar. So we're going to use Graph to create that connection and to push that data out to an Outlook calendar. So to do this, we're going to utilize a couple different tools. First of all, you'll need to install Postman on your computer. If you don't have it already installed, just Google Postman and download and install the desktop client. It's a free download. We're also going to look at the Microsoft Graph Explorer. So let me go ahead and open that up right now. Okay, I'll sign into my test account. Okay, so Graph Explorer basically gives you a whole bunch of sort of canned REST calls to the Graph API. So you have get, you have post, a bunch of different things you can do. So for example, if I just click on this, my profile, you can get information related to my account in Azure Active Directory. So there's a bunch of things you can do here. So we're going to use some of these things to help build out our REST calls in Postman. Graph Explorer is a great way to help you kind of build out these calls, and it also allows you to see what you can do in Graph Explorer. Now, there's a bunch of things, like if I go to show more examples here, you can see I've only chosen a few options here for these calls that I want to start to make, but there's a whole bunch that I haven't even turned on. So I definitely recommend checking that out. But so we're going to jump back and forth between Graph Explorer and Postman, but I just want to kind of give you an initial sort of overview of what exactly Graph Explorer is. And let's go ahead and jump into Postman. Okay, so here we are in Postman, and we're going to set up our environment so that we can start to create REST calls out to Graph. Now, before we get into that, let's just take one quick step back. For anyone who's not familiar with Postman, or you don't know what it is or what it does, it's basically a development environment that allows you to work with HTTP APIs. So there's a lot you can do with it. But basically, if you're working with any RESTful APIs or REST technology in general for your custom application or whatever you're working on, you can build out your REST calls in Postman. So for our use case, we're obviously going to be calling out to Microsoft Graph. So we're going to start to build out those REST calls in Postman. Now, when you're working with REST, typically, a lot of the times you'll have to first grab an access token from an authentication server and then use that token for subsequent calls in order to complete the call. So that's where we're going to start. Okay, so here I have my blank workspace. So you want to start off by going to create a new collection. So I'll call it Flow Graph Demo. And that just basically allows you to group your requests together. Next thing, we want to actually set up an environment so we can create some environment variables. So again, some of the stuff is covered in that blog series that I mentioned earlier, but it just helps you to create some efficiencies within your environment so you can just kind of plug in your variables wherever you need them. So let's go to add a new environment. So I'll call this flow graph demo. Okay, now the variables we're going to plug in here, if you remember back to the app that we set up in Azure, we had a few different values there. We had the app ID, we've got a tenant ID, and there was an app secret. So we want to create variables for those now. So I'm going to call this my app ID, and I'm going to just grab this value from Notepad. And we had, I'll say my tenant. And we're going to create a variable called my app secret. Okay, and we're also going to set up a variable called my access token, and we can leave that blank for now. All right, great. So now we'll just choose that environment and we'll have those variables readily accessible to us at any point. So now, as I mentioned, we have to call out to the authentication server to grab our token. So we want to set up the call to do that right now. So let's just go to add request, and then I'll call this get access token. Okay. So now we want to basically plug in a URL. Now this URL will allow you to grab the authentication token. So I'm going to plug in a variable here, the one I created called my tenant. Oops. Okay, that's fine. Now for this call, we want to go to headers and set up content type, which is going to be equal to application / x www form URL encoded. Okay, and now we're going to head over to the body tab here, and we're going to check this option off. And so now basically we're going to set this up. So we want to plug in grant type, and that's going to equal client credentials. We're going to have client ID equals my app ID. We're going to have client secret, and that's going to be equal to my app secret. And then scope is going to be equal to https graph.microsoft.com. All right, so now let's see if this works. And it did. Great. So that's going to grab our token for us, and this is the token that we need to use in our subsequent REST calls. So to take this one step further, what we can do is actually first let's save this. So we're going to save this as get access token. And I realize now that the first one that I created is now useless, so we'll just go ahead and delete that. And then what you can do is if you go to the tests tab and plug in this bit of code right here, what that's going to do is actually set your access token variable to the value that's returned back from the authentication server. So it's going to set it to this access token value here. And we're going to see shortly how you can use that, or well, how you have to use that in subsequent REST calls. So you see if I click send, I'll get a token back. And now if I go to my environment variables, I can see that it's now set my access token variable to that value. Okay, so next up, we're going to work with some more graph REST calls. Okay, so I mentioned how we're going to jump back and forth between Graph Explorer and Postman. So let's go ahead and do that now. This next piece is not required for our use case, but it's a good example of how you can use your access token to complete other REST calls. So let's go ahead and look at some of these sample queries. So I'm going to look at get all users in the organization. So if I just click on that here under users, obviously that's going to return these values, which is correct. Um, but what I can do is actually just go ahead and grab the get request here and then jump back to Postman. And I'm going to create a new request, add request. This is going to, I'll call this get users. Okay. Okay, so now plug in that request there, and we're going to put into our header authentication or authorization rather, and this is going to be set to bearer, and then we're going to set this variable to my access token. Okay, so now if I click this, there's our token, and now if we use this, there is all of our users, and we've actually just used that token that was generated from this access token request. So that's kind of how that works, and we're going to get into more of that very shortly, but that's how you can use that access token. Okay, so next up we want to complete some more requests that we're going to use later on in our flow. So let's go ahead and do we'll get a user by their email address. Okay, so now what we want to do is say get user by email, and if I do that, then obviously you can see this is going to default to mine because I'm logged in. But if I change that to somebody else, so we had J Carter set up. If I run that query, that's going to return Joe Carter. If I do, let's just do one more. So if I do R Alamar, that should work. R Alamar. Okay, so that's going to work fine. So if I grab this and plug it into Postman, again, we're going to go to add request. I'll say get user by email. And I'll plug that in. Let me just get that there. Users are Alamar, and okay, so same thing, authorization. No, sorry, headers, and it's going to be authorization, and it's bearer, and then access token. Okay. Okay, good. So right now, obviously, we've hard-coded that value in to look up that user, but we need to have that as a reference point for our flow because coming up, we're going to actually replace that with a variable, but I just want to have that there for a reference point. So we've covered a lot in this video. We've gone through an overview of Graph, Postman. We've performed some GET requests to the Graph API through Postman, as well as configured our environment. So I'm going to leave it there for now, but in the next video, we're going to take it a step further and get into doing some post requests where we're going to get into actually creating some data through Postman. And then following that, we'll get back into Flow. Okay, I'll see you in the next video.